Congress was not in favor of Johnson's plan for Reconstruction, so they came up with their own plan. Radical and moderate Republicans were furious with the South and Johnson's disregard for Reconstruction. Congress comes up with its own plan for Reconstruction. The goal of Congress was to make the South pay for the Civil War. Under Congress's plan, they enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted full citizenship rights to African Americans and outlawed all black codes in the South. This Civil Rights Act was a part of the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all former slaves. Both the Freedmen's Bureau Act and the Civil Rights Act was vetoed by Johnson, but the veto was overturned by Congress and became law. Remember what I said on the previous slide? The 14th Amendment was passed and guaranteed citizenship to all born in the United States, including former slaves and all races. Congress also passed the Military Reconstruction Act, which divided the South into 5 military districts governed by Union generals until they agreed to pass the 14th Amendment. Again, Johnson tried to veto this, but it was overturned. Here you see a map of the military zones in the South, headed by Union generals. Remember, President Johnson and Congress did not get along very well once he became president. Johnson was impeached. Impeach means to formally charge with misconduct during office. Johnson was impeached or charged with not following the Tenure of Office Act of 1867. The Tenure of Office Act said you could not fire a congressional official without Senate consent. However, Johnson ignores the act and he fires people that do not follow his lead. Once this trial goes before Congress, he is found innocent by 1 vote. Let's look at the presidential election of 1868. Johnson did serve out his term as president, but did not run for re-election. There had been too many scandals during his time in office. Ulysses S. Grant, who was a general during the Civil War for the Union, wins this election. He wins the Electoral College vote by a wide margin, but only wins the popular vote by about 306,000 votes. During this election, about 500 African Americans voted for the first time in history. This election really showed the importance of the African American vote. It was the 15th Amendment that allowed African American men to vote during this election. The 15th Amendment passed, which said no one can be kept from voting based on race. It was only men that were able to vote during this election, no women at this time, but any race of men could vote. Fraud and bribery hurt the Republican Party. President Ulysses S. Grant had no political experience prior to becoming the President of the United States. He had served in the military. He was a Republican, and during his time as president, he frequently appointed friends rather than people with proven ability. Many times his appointees turned out to be dishonest, and a series of scandals marred the presidency of Grant. Also, conditions in the South after the war were not good. Towns, land, the economy of the South had all been destroyed. There were public works programs established in the South to rebuild after the war. Let's look at the economy of the South after the war. Cotton was no longer king. Instead, many tobacco products were produced. Former slaves relied on sharecropping, which was living and working on the land for only a portion of the crops grown. Few former slaves saved enough to become tenant farmers, having their own piece of land and keeping all the crops. If you look at this diagram, it shows the horrible cycle of sharecropping. Many former slaves turned to this practice after the war because they had no other choice for jobs. The landowner, a white person, would provide land, seed, and tools to the sharecropper in exchange for a large share of the harvested crop. The sharecropper would purchase supplies from the landowner on store credit, often at high interest rates. The sharecropper would plant and harvest the crop. The landowner would sell the crop and take the predetermined share. The sharecropper's portion of the crop was worth less than the amount owed to the landowner. And the sharecropper must promise the landowner a larger share of next year's crop and becomes trapped in a vicious cycle of debt. Sharecropping was essentially another stronghold on African Americans living in the South. Let's look at the collapse of Reconstruction. For a while, Congress tried to protect African American former slaves in the South. The Ku Klux Klan, a group of white Southerners, terrorized African Americans. These aimed attacks were at symbols of black freedom, teachers, schools, churches, and voting places. For a while, the government was able to protect former slaves, but in time, the government turned their attention away from acts of the Klan. Jim Crow laws, which restricted freedom of blacks and kept them from getting political, economic, or social power, also took effect in the South. This included segregation of all public places. Federal enforcement of anti-Klan laws became limited. And by 1880, the KKK had managed to restore white supremacy in much of the South. The government could not control this group during this time because they did instill fear and terror in people in the South. Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case that said separate but equal is legal. This happened in 1896 after Reconstruction. This really established the separate but equal doctrine throughout the United States until the late 1950s and 1960s. The Redeemers were the white Southerners after the war that wanted to redeem the South by regaining power in Congress. Northerners' support of Reconstruction also fades. Over time, Northern voters began to be more concerned with national issues, debt, rather than Reconstruction. As public support decreased for Reconstruction, Republicans backed away from the issue. Many believed they could not impose the moral and social changes needed to make progress in the South. The election of 1876. With the election of 1876, Reconstruction came to an end. Samuel Tilden was the Democrat versus Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. Tilden wins the popular vote over Hayes, but was one electoral vote short of becoming president. When that happens, the election must be decided by the Congress. Democrats controlled the House and had to decide the election since no one had the majority in the Electoral College. This is a map of the Electoral College vote in 1876. You can see no one received majority. It was 50% to 50%. A deal was made, known as the Compromise of 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes became president as a part of this deal, not Tilden, even though he received the most votes in the popular vote. Instead, Hayes was inaugurated and chosen as president by Congress. His election effectively ended Reconstruction. Let's look at some key takeaways of Reconstruction. The Union is restored. African Americans gain citizenship and voting rights. The South economy and infrastructure are improved. Southern states establish a public school system. The KKK and other groups terrorize African Americans in the South for decades. Sharecropping system takes hold in the South.